Hey everyone, my name is Alex Volkov. I'm the host for this panel. Our title of our panel is going to be From MVP to Production, and it looks like we're almost all of us here. I think we're missing one more person. And while she joins, I'm just going to introduce myself briefly and I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourself as well. As I said, my name is Alex Volkov. I'm an AI evangelist with Weights and Biases, and I'm also the host of the ThursdAI podcast, a recording of which I just came 30 minutes ago. So I'm still kind of hyped up about the everything that happened in the AI for this week. And I'm here to host a panel on everything from MVP to production. I have an amazing panel here. So we're going to start with, let's say, I'm going to ask you guys to just introduce yourself. I guess we'll start with Eric, and then I'm going to call out some names, introduce yourself, and then we're going to get started.
Awesome. Thanks for having me here today. I'm Eric Peter. I'm one of the PM leads on the AI platform, Databricks. I look after kind of two primary areas. First are our model training capabilities. So what are the tools that we provide to help customers build AI models? That's everything from a simple scikit-learn model through fine-tuning large language models, all the way up through kind of pre-training completely from scratch large language models. Second, I look after retrieval augmented generation. So how do we help customers with that? I know RAG's the fun buzzword. I'd really call it more like AI systems. It's a lot more than retrieval is what we found out. And we deliver tools there to help folks really build high quality applications. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we've heard from our customer base. And in both of these efforts, I work really closely with our academic research team, who are kind of working on everything from building their own foundational models to defining new information retrieval techniques to new programming paradigms for large language models. So excited to be here and chat with everyone.
Awesome. Thank you for joining, Eric. And then I want to ask Don to introduce and say what you're working on.
All right. Hi, I'm Danae. So I work as a machine. No worries. I work as a machine learning engineer with Process. So yeah, we're working on using LLMs to create assistants that kind of help portfolio companies, and now we're going public with a product that acts as like an AI assistant. And I'm currently focusing on doing that for like very specific use cases within the companies that we work with.
Incredible. Andrew, hey, how are you, man?
Good. How are you doing? Great, Mike. Sounds great. I'm Andrew. I am co-founder and CPO of Last Mile AI. I used to be the GPM for AI platform at Facebook AI, and then did some AI at other companies before that. Started Last Mile AI. Last Mile AI is a company that's building a generative AI platform. Basically, been working a lot on ML platforms before, and now what is a generative AI platform and how do we help solve that? And so actively thinking about MVP to production and what does production mean for generative AI and how does it differ from traditional ML? Cool. Nice to meet everyone.
Awesome. Nice to meet you, Andrew. And Philip, last but not least, definitely tell us about what you guys are doing at Honeycomb.
Hello, my name is Philip. I'm on the product team at Honeycomb. We are not an AI company, primarily not doing AI stuff. But what I think is quite exemplary of where we're at in this industry right now is you don't have to be an AI company to actually do useful shit with this tech. And some of the things that I do there is I'm kind of sort of the main person who like builds and prototypes things and sort of gets them into production in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Started that last year and got started driving a little bit into AI observability or like large language model observability in particular, and really focusing on how you can use just information from production to directly impact I shouldn't say directly impact, directly improve the features that you're actually building. And base that not on like speculation, but on like, hey, this is what people are actually doing, and this is how we can use that to understand patterns and inputs and outputs and meaningfully improve what we have in production, because our users are going to want stuff to get better over time instead of worse.
Awesome. So I wanted to maybe use this as a kind of the first talking point, getting feedback from production. So it's been fairly clear that once different APIs were released for ChatGPT, a lot of excitement. Folks, boards are talking, pushing their CEOs like, hey, you have to add AI. You have to, like, what's your AI strategy? Everybody started building MVPs. A lot of like glowing videos on X and elsewhere, and then putting those production in the hands of your users, suddenly you get things like, well, this doesn't actually work, or this says something that the company is not really aligned with. I guess, Philip, we'll start with you because you mentioned this first. What are some things you've seen that changed since something that you've kind of played in internally and kind of presented to stakeholders and then went to production, and then the users kind of showed that, there's something there we have to fix? Did you have a moment like this?
Oh, absolutely. I think somebody is quite arrogant if they think that they're going to be able to predict what their users are going to try to do with what they throw into production. It's rather easy, actually, I would say, in many cases, not necessarily all cases, but it's rather easy to get something to the point where it's probably good enough to go to production. But that's where the hard stuff actually starts. You're going to find that, at least in my experience, that when you present sort of not even just a blank canvas, but just like a way for someone to input what they actually want to input, like what's closer to their mental model, rather than them having to learn like the particular gestures of like your particular UI or something like that. You find that they're going to approach your product just differently than they would have if you didn't have that user interface in there in the first place. And so that almost kind of resets expectations around what users are going to want to do and what they're going to try to do. And that gets you to the point where, like, okay, if we want to actually keep this thing in production, we have to take like what they're actually doing and what they're getting back. And if there's a way to get it, like what they think about that information, like what they're getting back, and feed that back into development. And it's like, I mean, the software industry always talks about like, oh yeah, we should be shipping code faster and we should be like learning from what we're shipping and all that. Most teams don't really do that very well, but you really, like, this cranks it up. You have to do that very well here, because otherwise you're just going to ship shit, and like nobody wants bad software that's all janky and doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. And I think like Gen AI in particular makes that a lot harder, because you're dealing with things that are, in some cases, sometimes by design, non-deterministic, but then also dealing with like practically unbounded inputs that anybody could put in that you have kind of no hope of predicting upfront.
I guess I see quite a few folks agree, so I'm going to ask Danae. Danae, I saw you kind of go like this for a few items here. Talk to us about how you guys are dealing with the problem of users doing unexpected things, or even following back and seeing what users actually did to improve the continued kind of deployment, the next deployment, especially as these models are non-deterministic. Oh, I think I cannot hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, so it's interesting that this was the first thing that came up, because that's definitely been for us, this MVP process to production is definitely the place where you're finding, oh, it looked fine it looked fine while we tested, and we had, done due process, we had test sets, we had checked and we tested, but once you give these things to users, they just don't behave in the way that you expect them to. I think that comes from a place of, we're designing with the people who have defined the problem, but not necessarily the people that use it. And then we're also giving people blank canvases, and they don't think about these things the same way that we think about them, and they don't always understand kind of what's happening under the hood, and so they treat it as a black box, and black boxes are magic, right? So it is a challenge, and I think what we've done, or what we're working on, is kind of what we think of as an evaluation period. So it doesn't have to go from 0 to 100. You can release in sort of phases, so stepped releases. Give it to, if you have like an end goal user who is like a very general user, you don't have to go straight to them. You can go to an in-between person who has some expectation of what it's going to do, but also some understanding of how it's being built. And they can test it in a way that's a bit closer to real life and get feedback. And you can kind of iterate on that process and gradually work up to your final end user. And this kind of evaluation period is, because it's also smaller, you can evaluate on a much deeper level than you could if you're getting hundreds and hundreds of new users at the same time. And I think for us, that's been really useful to get an understanding of how real users are going to use it, without risking releasing a product that we don't always understand what's going to happen afterwards.
Yeah, I wanna send it to Eric. I say, Eric, you're in constant agreement here, and getting that evaluation. And evaluation is a big thing that I would like us to kind of to stay on for a minute. Getting that evaluation back into your like model training and continuous like updating, whether if you're serving your own models, whether you're like fine tuning some prompts as well. Definitely a big piece of all of this. And in the MVP, at least for some folks who are just building like a quick demo, that's not something folks think about. They don't think about. Oh, they're like, okay, I wrote my prompts, I put it up. How have you found this kind of transition, both from the folks who are building kind of maybe agents and retrieval systems where evaluation is hard, but also from putting it out there in the actual user's hands and then seeing what they actually do this and then bring it back and iteratively improve the product?
Yeah, I mean, I think the process now that you kind of described of like, hey, like giving it to a small group of users who are somewhat close, but not necessarily the full breadth of users. That's what we see a lot of our customers do. We actually call it like the expert stakeholders or the internal stakeholders, where you have 4 or 5 experts who are kind of like, maybe they're not the first person who defined the requirements, but they're close enough to actually understand the content. Because a lot of the times for like our developers, the challenge they run into is they're like, well, I actually don't know if this answer is right. Like I'm building a bot for the HR team, or I'm building a bot for the customer support team, and like this answer looks good, but like I don't actually know. This isn't my day job. I'm a data scientist. I'm not an expert in this. And so having that loop and being able to get really fast cycles from that small group is really important. And I think the thing there is like having the right tooling to do that is incredibly important, because the most brute force way to do that is, hey, here you can come chat with the thing. I'll write it down in an Excel spreadsheet and give me notes. And or that's maybe the second most brute force. The first one is, oh, just go play with it and tell me if it's working or not. And what we've heard from a lot of folks is we'll get feedback like, yeah, it doesn't work. I hate it. They're like, well, which ones weren't working? They're like, oh, was that question I asked about? And it's like, well, that's not helpful for me. And so a lot of what we help our customers with is how do we make it really, really easy to put tooling in place such that every time someone uses it, no matter what, there's a log, there's a full capture of everything that happens. And there's the ability for the end user to quickly send like a thumbs up, thumbs down, along with rationale, and even go as far as edit and look at what was retrieved along with it. But I think, Alex, to your point, you said like, well, logging and looking at the feedback is one part, but like, how do you actually measure it, right? Like, it's great if I can go look qualitatively through a bunch of things and see that maybe people are happy or unhappy, but what are the metrics I can use? And so I think that's a really important part. And we see both emerging, kind of the standard information retrieval metrics that people use, but also this emerging kind of area of LLM judge-oriented metrics where you can actually get pretty detailed feedback from having a model judge these things. And that's not perfect, right? Because it's not quite the same as a human, but it can give you additional signals to work with and kind of have a suite of metrics to look at.
And I wanna ask Andrew as well. Andrew, any of what we're saying resonates with how you approach figuring out what doesn't really quite work for users in production?
Yeah, so you might have to dig me out if I get too into the weeds, because I've been thinking about this for so long, and we've been working with some customers on this that I might get a little bit too deep into it. But as for evaluation, it really breaks into 3 possible steps. The first one is you have human annotation, human in loop style, right? Which is like audit logs or manual experimentation, where you're able to manually annotate whether the results are right or wrong. Then you have like your heuristic-based ones, which are like the classic NLP n-gram algorithms for figuring out whether the results produced are correct. And then the last one that Eric talked about, which is LLM-based, or feed it into a large language model. Each one has its pros and cons. Generally, people are thinking more about the annotation style or the LLM one. The problem with the annotation style, it's pretty expensive. You're looking at going to a company and trying to spin that up. But the biggest difference is it's no longer the annotation that people are familiar with, which is like you can get a lot of people to help annotate. Now it's like specialized roles. I was talking to a company and they mentioned that they have a summarization task. And so part of the annotation process is who can distill 100 pages of material into a single paragraph and annotate that, which is like, it's no longer just, someone you find. Now it's like, we need an expert who can process 100 pages of data and really annotate whether the summary is correct. The other approach of LLM is great, but it's quite costly, right? And you're kind of feeding GPT-4 results or any LLM back into another LLM, and you're doing some system prompting to try to get it the right results. We found the most progress with actually not using LLMs, and we use more encoder-based models, which are much cheaper. like when you think about evaluators, they're just classification problems. And so if you can have a really robust classification problem that's like 1/500th of the cost, why not go with that approach? The hardest thing though is it's so diverse. I think Philip and Donnie mentioned it, which was like so many people have so many different requirements for it. And so you find evaluation is less of single metric driven, more of like a composite metric or many different functions people are optimizing for. And so there's some assertions that go on, which is like, is this valid JSON or Markdown? There's some content quality, which is this faithful to what's retrieved in the original data set? Is this relevant to the answer? And so some composite goes on, and it's almost like industry based. We've been working with different industries, and each one is so nuanced. It's so difficult to do it broadly for everyone. It almost feels like you need a custom one per industry. Hopefully not every company needs a custom one, because that's unscalable.
That's true. And I wanted to dig into the custom industry one, because it's going to be impossible to cover all the possible industries, and the very generic answer may not be the super most helpful one for our listeners here. And maybe I'll go around and ask like one industry specific thing that you can think of that maybe in evaluations, like an example that you had to work through in how to actually build an evaluation for, right? It's fairly difficult. So whoever wants to go first in the industry specific one, Andrew, if you mentioned a few, feel free. But also let's go around the table and just like see how we're differing. Like there's difference between a lawyer summarization task, for example, and the translation for another example.
Yeah, I can start off with one of the most classic ones, which is for sales. NASA actually means North America, South America regions. Not the NASA that will most likely come up from any LLM, which is our space agency. And so having that context-aware evaluation to understand that it's a sales-specific system, and it should actually use the terminology and vernacular similar for sales and whatever the acronyms are used. And I think all of us who've come from those companies that have 1,000 acronyms, Facebook used to have a dedicated internal site for acronyms. You're going to find yourself needing to do that translation and make sure that the answers are correct, as opposed to the original training data that is most likely embedded into the LM. So that's the first example that comes to mind for me.
One example from us is that we've built a bot for translations, and then it started translating the links as well. And for example, weights and biases, you don't want like brand names to be translated, because this in Spanish does not sound like what it needs. Eric, I see you also like having fun with this. Do you have any like industry specific examples of what you had to work through in like a specific domain or industry?
Yeah, I mean, I could actually just give an example from some things we've been doing on our own products, like with our coding assistant. And so one of the things, obviously, we want the coding assistant to be helpful, right? Like it's like generically helpful, right? Well, what does helpful mean? Well, helpful, what we kind of discovered was that if you just asked GPT-4 to evaluate if an answer was helpful or not, it essentially says close to 100% of the time that what the LLM generated was helpful. Because it's like, okay, well, like, they asked a question, here's some response. And so not until you kind of prompted the LLM with kind of very specific guidelines of what does helpful mean, and kind of, so you almost set it up as a few shot problem rather than a 0-shot type problem. But that's kind of one specific example where you do have to give the model some context. And once you did that, you actually started to see pretty good results in terms of, there's some helpful and not helpful answers. But I think that pattern probably applies across other ones, right? Like one bank told me, they're like, Eric, for safety, for us, it means something different than everyone who talks about like swearing. It means like specific, incorrect, infactual information, because that's a safety issue for us, because we might make a bad trade on it. And so kind of what these definitions actually mean to each person, I see where the LLM judges can be going. And like, I think where we're going to take them is to make them so that they can start to be tuned with that small number of human labels you get. And that's a lot of the research that we're doing. So ultimately, Andrew kind of made the point of they're expensive. Well, the best way to reduce costs is to distill something down to a smaller model. And if you can, while doing that, you can also get something that's like a little bit, essentially tune the classifier head on the end of it, you can get a lot better outcome there.
Awesome. Danae, I want to hear from you as well. I saw that some of this resonates.
Yeah, so just like this idea of like context is really important for the models, and to like do the right thing is the context. I think for what we're working on right now is around SQL, but SQL, with the actual user's data, and there the issue becomes distilling the context in a way that it can use enough of it without losing itself. And then I think also, again, like the challenge of working with like consumers directly is a lot of the implied knowledge. A lot of what they know is not always available to the questions they're going to ask, and how do we then map that? Or I think the biggest challenge is get the model to recognize that it doesn't know that and ask for clarification. These the abbreviations and the terminology that's so specific, if it can make an inference, it will. And like that, getting it to understand that you don't know everything, so please check. That's kind of one of the things that's interesting about working with a model that can know so much.
That's true, and I think for many people, definitely the assurance with which the seriousness with which the model is like, yeah, this is the right answer, and it's not.
Exactly.
The confuses users on the other side, because users are used to something that it's clear as an answer. Philip, have you run into these issues as well? What's your take on how to even know when a failure mode fails, and how to even like grab those information and use them to actually improve some of these evaluation methods, the models?
So yeah, that's a really difficult one. I've primarily been working, like when I think of my day-to-day work, not like user interviews and stuff, primarily with like data querying. The problem is data querying is a very generic term. There's like a million different databases out there that all have like different ways that they're like really good at some stuff and really bad at other stuff. And your LLM does not know the difference between these things at all. Like it has a passing knowledge of like various query languages, but it has no understanding of like, is this actually a good query for the task that I have at hand? I've found in my case that like the thing that really differentiates someone is, like, it feels a little bit obvious, but like actually being able to run something that the LLM generates and find a way to evaluate if how correct or useful it is, in tandem with like presenting something to someone in some way. So like it's a little bit generic, but like for example with Honeycomb, there is we're effectively a data querying platform for your observability data. A query has a particular shape, and there are like rules for that. So like there's levels of validation and evaluation even before we go and run the query that we can sort of like say, okay, here's like some hard criteria if this actually works or not. That can be a surprisingly deep thing to go and solve for, because I guarantee you're going to have your product in like something that like some users kind of want to do that's like kind of awkward to do in your product. And like in Honeycomb's case, saying the words, what is my error rate, is like a surprisingly challenging, difficult question to answer. We're really, really good at other questions, but that one, maybe not so much. And like, what is a useful query for that? Trick question. There is no useful query for that. So, but it still outputs something. So like now we're getting into, okay, well, we're giving you something. Is that something actually helpful, and does that set you on the right path, or does that lead you astray somewhere? And like that's, I think, a point that a lot of people are going to be heading down towards eventually, once they get past the initial hump of like, okay, we're generally doing the right thing. If you want to be really useful for people, especially the people sort of thinking like from a Pareto distribution standpoint, like that smaller percentage of things that are a little bit like wonky inputs, but tend to be really important for a lot of people, that's where you're really going to make or break having a good product experience using this stuff. And that's where I've not found any best practices really. And it ends up being so domain specific that there are ways that you can quantify if something is good or not. But it ends up being so like custom almost, that like you have to instrument this thing for yourself, and you have to bake in some of that domain knowledge about like, what is generally a useful thing versus what is generally a not useful thing. And if you don't have that domain knowledge from like people on your engineering team, your product team, and so on, who deeply understand like generally what is helpful for customers, even if it's not actually what they're asking for, then that's where you're going to end up struggling a lot, because I guarantee you that people with the title of like VP and executive staff or whatever are going to like expect this stuff to be able to do that. And if it doesn't do that, then you're kind of in trouble.
So I want to talk about, you mentioned knowledge as well, and I want to talk about specifically if you're building a model or you're using model in production, just a straight up model, you're kind of at the whim of the cutoff date when OpenAI decided to kind of stop the knowledge cutoff, October, December 23, whatever. They keep updating this. And if you have a rack system on top of this information knowledge system, like Eric said, you still at the risk of providing some amount of information. Let's say it's not like a live API, everything sits in the vector store. And then that also is kind of, it could go stale. So how are you guys thinking about this additional problem of data ingestion and updates pipeline? How are you like keeping the knowledge up to date? I see, Andrew, you're agreeing with this, and then maybe Eric. Let's talk about how we before we even get this to the users, how do we even make sure that the latest version of our SDK appears there, or the latest version of documentation also gets in there, and the model actually knows about this? Andrew, you're
go
first.
For it, Andrew, if you want.
Yeah, with a big smile, so I'll go first.
Yeah.
I mean, it sucks. Like,
Yeah.
Long story short, it's like a massive version control problem. We've extracted as much out as possible to try to version control everything, because there's two things, which is it sucks when it becomes updated underneath the hood, because then you see some type of performance or distribution change in terms of the performance it was delivering. And it also sucks when the other side, when like you want to keep it up to date, how to refresh it and make sure that you understand when to reevaluate things. The best that we can do is just like, try to version control everything. Actually, like, I don't know how many folks here have like been part of like the recommendation systems for some of these companies. It feels very familiar. Like you're trying to version control all the infrastructure for retrieval, the data sources, the processing pipelines, and then the under LLM. And you're trying to fix that version and say, this is pin version. If we A/B test it, do it with a B. But you've like versioned everything, and it's like, this is getting so gnarly. There's no way to roll back because it's going to be so painful. It feels the same. And that's the funny thing. Maybe like, I think I listened a little bit into the talk before, and they're talking about how many of the problems seem so familiar to just classic MLOps problems. It's like, it's funny because it's under the generative AI umbrella, but we're, for all of us, we're just like, yeah, this is like, it's the same problems under a different name. And it hurts maybe even more now.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting, because I was going to say, like, we kind of like, Philip, you alluded at the idea of like evaluation sets and like actually curating for you kind of like what's a good and bad answer. And like, it's funny because I think like maybe a year ago, a lot of people, Jennifer AI's magic, it's going to change it. We can just put this thing out in production. It's going to be awesome. And I think it's kind of funny to see now the world shifting back to like what ML practitioners have been doing like for, not hundreds of years, whatever, some very large number of years, which is, okay, when we start our task, we're going to go curate ground truth evaluation set. We're going to decide what metrics we're going to hill climb on. And now like the rest of the world, everyone who's doing generative AI is like, oh, wow, like actually like now I get why that's necessary. And so it's interesting to see, Andrew, to your point, like these paradigms that like have been around for many years coming back. And like, it's a much harder problem now, because hill climbing on a regression model with a ground truth set is like that ground truth that's relatively straightforward to collect, but hill climbing on a non-deterministic English language input output is a much harder problem. But Alex, to answer your original question, like keeping things up to date, right? Like, there's obviously, you could say like, I'm going to retrain my LLM every day or every night. Like, I don't think that's practical. And what we've seen is like that is why people start using these systems that are like for RAG or, augmenting the prompt with information. But like, in our view, what it comes back down to is it's data. Where's your data? How good is your data? Is your data available? Do you have a robust infrastructure to version control it? Do you have a robust infrastructure to deploy it? And at least for us, what we see is like, this is why like a lot of our customers are like, yeah, it makes sense to build our generative AI stuff right on top of our data platform. Because guess what? Like, that's what we need. That's where we have to start. We have to get our vector database in sync with our source systems. And so I think just having those pipelines, having that right, like it becomes even more critical these days. But whether you build it on Spark or you build it on, choose your favorite data pipeline builder and Poison.
Guys, this has been full of insight. One of the takeaways that I have from this is just, okay, this new slogan, LLM ops, same problem, new name, but it hurts a lot more. This is my takeaway. Thank you, guys. I think we have a couple of questions from the chat. One of them is from Jeffrey. What would be the right tooling to capture and annotate user feedback? We've been looking at Argilla, but interested in what else is out there. Any ideas?
I think we can all do our shameless plugs.
Go for it.
We have great tools for that at Databricks, but that'd be my biased answer.
Have you guys mostly just built these things in-house? Do you use just like off the shelf? Yeah.
At Honeycomb, it's all in-house. Granted, since we're an observability company, we have really good observability for our product, and user feedback is basically like a column on an event. And so because we have that sort of rich instrumentation, we can just slice and dice based off of user feedback and splay out like, okay, thumbs down result, what was unique about inputs and outputs? Or like, we know this to be a bad output given an input, what's unique about user feedback related to that? There's probably some more tools that can do that out there, but like, frankly, if you have pretty robust like application observability, it's quite straightforward to add that. And then use it within another tool. Just don't do it maybe with one that doesn't handle high cardinality data very well, like Datadog. Otherwise, or at least be careful about doing it. They have a great product, but that's a way to get your build to explode. So watch out for that one.
It always comes down to the shameless plug.
It's like the anti-plug.
Any other answers?
I mean, a quick plug, if we're doing shameless plug, everything in weights and biases is stored and like evaluated within weights and biases. We have reports. We have an internal bot called WantBot. You guys check it out. It's on Slack. I think it's now on part of the custom GPTs as well. We can ask and get like a precise answer of how to set up everything weights and biases end to end. And WantBot has, and we've open sourced WantBot and its evaluations and auto evaluations, and also reports, how we built it and how we're doing the data pipeline ingestion and auto evaluations as well. And we mentioned some automatic evaluations like GPT-led evaluations, and all that data and all of the ability for us to know whether a small change in the vector database or embedding dimensionality or even GPT-4 and different model, all of this kind of like happens and is tracked obviously with weights and biases. So you can take it from the model training all the way to production and then kind of see in end to end what changed and how it affected your users eventually.
Nice. Thank you very much, guys. By the way, in New York City, we ran a workshop, the MLOps community in New York did, of how to build the WantBot. So that was pretty fun.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, everybody. Please stick around in the chat in case people have more questions. And it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was a great panel.